as you know that two systems of your body belong to the control systems, right? The nervous system and the endocrine system. And nervous system is the first acting control system. Endocrine system is relatively slower because nervous system acts by what? Electrical signal transmission, right? Endocrine system works by releasing hormones. That's why it is relatively slower. So first we'll talk about the nervous system in general. First we'll see the functions of the nervous system. Then we'll talk about the divisions of the nervous system. Then we'll talk about the cells of the neural tissue. Two types of cells are present in the neural tissue or nervous system. You already know that. Neurons and glia, neuroglial cells. In histology, in tissue lab, you have learned that. We'll talk about those two types of cells. Neurons are the main cells and neuroglial cells are the supporting cells. We'll talk about both. Then we'll talk about a few other structures found in the nervous system. Those are called tracts, nuclei, gray matter, white matter. So we'll see what are those structures we see inside the nervous system. Tracts, nuclei, gray matter, white matter. Okay? Then we'll talk about the reflex and the reflex arc. First, the functions of the nervous system. Your nervous system performs many functions because it is the control system. However, we can divide all those functions into three types or three groups. Sensory input, one type of function, integration, another type of function, and motor output. So those are three types of functions your nervous system performs. Let me give you a few examples of sensory inputs. Remember, sensory input goes towards the brain, towards the what? Brain, from outside. So when I touch your skin, that touch signal goes from the skin to the brain. Make sense? When you see something, what happens? From the eye, signal goes to the brain. You know that, right? When you listen something, from the ear, signal goes to the brain. Make sense? So all those are sensory inputs. You can give many examples, right? So sensory inputs are the signals go from the outer organs of the body to the brain. For example, from your skin to the brain, from your eye to the brain, from your ear to the brain. When you put food on your tongue, right? That taste signal goes from the tongue to the brain. Make sense? When you smell something, from the nose, signal goes to the brain. All those belong to what? Sensory input. Make sense? Okay. Then integration. After your brain receives those signals, brain does what? Just think simple and tell me. If I touch your skin, right? That signal goes to the brain, right? Sensory input. Then brain does what? Interprets, right? What is that? Right? Is it hot or cold? Right? The touch is hot or cold. Is it painful or is it harmful or comfortable? Right? All those signals are interpreted by the brain. Right? Brain will analyze those signals, and that is called integration. That is very important, right? Like, just think that something touched your skin, your brain, you need to know if it is hot or cold, right? If it is too hot, then you have to move your hand away, right? Otherwise it can burn your skin. Make sense? So your brain needs to interpret, analyze that signal, right? What kind of signal is that, right? Is it hot or cold? Can it harm you or not, right? All those are quickly done, right? Very quickly, because you have to decide very fast. So you see that integration is done by the brain, and it is done slow or fast? Very fast, right? Quickly, because you have to make decision. And then the brain sends signal to the effector organs to perform the action. Again, same example. If something very hot touches your skin, your brain will, interpret that and quickly send signal where? Now you tell me. From the brain, signal will go to the muscle to move the hand away, right? Skin cannot move the hand away. Who can move the hand away? Muscle, right? So you see, from the skin, signal is going to the brain. What kind of signal is that? Sensory input. Is it clear? Then your brain is interpreting that, analyzing that, and quickly sending signal to the muscle to move the hand away, right? So from the brain to the muscle, that is the motor output. Make sense? So those are three types of functions your nervous system performs. Another example, when you are thirsty, you look for water. If you see a glass of water, okay? You see a glass of water, the signal sensory input goes from where to where? You are seeing. Eye to the brain, right? Makes sense? So that is sensory input in this case. Then your brain, in this case, the brain will do what? When you see a glass of water, your brain will quickly decide something. Is it water or not? First thing, right? It could be acid, or in chemistry lab you will be more careful, right? You won't drink anything. So your brain, you see, first decides, is it water or not, right? Is it clean or not? Make sense? If it is water and you decide to drink it, your brain also interprets the distance, because you have to move the hand, right, to grab it, the shape of that glass, right? All those things are processed in the brain. Make sense? And then brain sends signal to the hand muscles, right, to grab it. Make sense? So that is what? Motor output, going from the brain to the muscle. Okay? So you see that integration function is very important that your brain does to send the motor command to the muscle. Okay? Divisions of the nervous system. First, we divide the nervous system into two parts: central nervous system, or CNS, and peripheral nervous system, or PNS. So the nervous system is divided into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Okay? Central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So this is the brain and this is the spinal cord. So central nervous system consists of a brain and a spinal cord. Okay. Peripheral nervous system consists of nerves. Okay? And nerves could be different types. Cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Okay? What are the cranial nerves and what are the spinal nerves? Cranial nerves are those nerves attached to the brain. Okay, so cranial nerves are the nerves attached to the what? Brain. So these are cranial nerves. And spinal nerves are attached to the spinal cord. See, these are the spinal nerves. Okay, so these are the cranial nerves attached to the brain. These are the spinal nerves attached to the spinal cord. How many cranial nerves in human nervous system? We have 12 pairs. Okay, 12 pairs. How many spinal nerves we have? 31 pairs. Okay. Now, cranial nerves could be sensory and motor. Two types, sensory and motor. Now you tell me, when you see something, I gave you that example, from the eye, signal is taken to the brain, right? Sensory input. So that is sensory because signal is going from the eye to the brain, right? Towards the brain. So those cranial nerves take the signal towards the brain. Those are called sensory. Those are called sensory nerves. Okay? Taking the signal towards the brain. Example, your optic nerve from the eye to the brain. Make sense? Optic nerve from the eye to the brain. Now you tell me, after your brain interprets that signal, I told you that signal from the brain goes to the effector organ, right? For example, muscles. So that is motor. So those nerves are taking the signal from the brain to the effector. Those are called what? Motor. Make sense? So those nerves take the signal from the brain to the effector. Those are called the motor nerves. So these are motor. From the brain to the effector. For example, muscle. This one, for example, from your eye to the brain, from your ear to the brain, from your nose to the brain, from your tongue to the brain, right? From your skin to the brain. All these are sensory. And from the brain to the muscle, motor. So cranial could be sensory or motor. Now spinal nerves, remember, are mixed type nerves. So inside the spinal nerve, you have two types of fibers. Some fibers are taking the signal towards the brain or towards the spinal cord. Some are taking outwards, away. So that's why spinal nerves are called what? Mixed type nerve. Because spinal nerve has both types of fibers. sensory and motor. Okay. So sensory and motor. Now motor and sensory. Sensory is also called afferent and motor is also called efferent. Just remember A arrival and E exit, getting out. So sensory are afferent, motor are efferent, getting out, exiting. Now motor could be again two types. This one, okay, somatic motor, which is voluntary, and autonomic motor, which is involuntary. So motor is divided into somatic and autonomic. So these are two types of motor. Somatic motor, the signal goes from the brain to the skeletal muscles. Brain to the skeletal muscles. Now, you tell me, let me ask you, when something, same example I am giving you, when something hot touches your skin, then signal goes to the brain, right? What kind of signal is that? Sensory input, right? Then your brain interprets that. What is that? Then brain sends signal to the muscle and you move your hand away. Make sense? That is the motor output. Now, if you decide that I want to move my hand away, can you do that? I will not move. You can do that, right? You can actually. If you decide that I don't care, it burns my skin, you can do that, right? So you have that control, right? Your brain sends signal to the muscle, but you can control it. Let me give you the easier example. I already gave you glass of water, right? If you decide that I will not drink now, I will not move my hand out, to grab it, you can do that. If you decide that I will drink it, you can do that, right? So that motor output going from the brain to the muscle is voluntary or involuntary? Voluntary, right? It's your decision. So you see that motor output going from the brain to the muscle, skeletal muscle, is voluntary in this case, right? So that is motor, but what kind of motor? Somatic or voluntary? Make sense? To the muscle. Okay. Now autonomic. Let me give you an example of autonomic. If you are hungry and you see very delicious food, sensory signal from the eye, food, the picture of food from the eye goes to the brain, right? So that is sensory input. And your brain will interpret that. What kind of food is that? Is it delicious or not, right? Although, then brain, in this case, brain sends signal to the salivary gland, right? And gastric gland to the stomach. Make sense? Do you control it or it happens itself? Itself, right? Make sense? Secretion occurs in the mouth, you don't have any control. It will happen by itself, right? So you see, the brain is sending signal to the glands, right? Salivary gland, gastric gland, and secretion occurs. So that is involuntary. Make sense? So that is motor, but what kind of motor? Involuntary motor. Autonomic. It will happen by itself. Is it clear? Okay. Now, the last thing, autonomic could be two types, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So, two types of or two divisions of autonomic nervous system. One is called sympathetic and another is called parasympathetic. Okay. Sympathetic is responsible for fight or flight response. Have you heard that? Fight or flight. So when you get scared, your heart rate increased, right? Your heart rate increased, muscle tone also increases, right? Your respiratory rate, your secretion, all those things increase. That is fight or flight response. Sympathetic activation does that. Increases the heart rate, increases the muscle tone, increases the respiration, all those things. Parasympathetic is just opposite. When you are in relaxed condition, when you are relaxed, what happens in the heart rate? Slows down, right? When you are relaxed, heart rate goes down, right? So opposite of sympathetic. Blood pressure goes down, right? Muscle tone goes down. So those are the response of parasympathetic activation. Just opposite of sympathetic. Is it clear? So sympathetic and parasympathetic are opposite. So let's quickly go back again. How we classify the nervous system. First we divide the nervous system into what? Central nervous system or CNS and peripheral nervous system or PNS. Make sense? Central nervous system consists of what?
The brain.
Brain and
Spinal cord.
the spinal cord, right? So this and this. Make sense? And peripheral nervous system consists of many nerves. Clear? And nerves could be cranial or spinal, right? Those nerves are attached to the brain. Those are what? Cranial. Because this is the cranial, right? Cranium. And those nerves are attached to the spinal cord. Those are spinal nerves. Very simple. Now cranial could be how many types? Two. Some cranial nerves are taking sensory input to the brain, right? So those are sensory. Some are taking the motor output. Those are motor cranial nerves, right? Now cranial nerves could be sensory or motor. Sensory is also called what? Afferent, arriving, okay? And motor are also called what? Efferent, exiting. Is it clear? Starts with E. Okay. Now, motor could be voluntary or somatic and involuntary, right? Involuntary is also called what? Autonomic. Is it clear? So somatic is voluntary, autonomic is what?
Voluntary.
Involuntary. Now, when you decide you will move your hand, brain sends signal to the skeletal muscles, right? You move your hand. So that is voluntary or involuntary? Voluntary. Is it clear? So somatic. And when you see delicious food or smell delicious food, secretion occurs from the salivary gland, gastric gland. That is what?
Involuntary.
Involuntary or
Autonomic.
autonomic. Is it clear? Now autonomic has two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic activation will cause what?
Fight or flight.
Yes. That means your heart rate will go up, right? Excitement. In just one word, sympathetic will cause what? Excitement. Now you know what happens when you are excited, right? Your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up, right? So muscle tone goes up. So that is sympathetic activation. And parasympathetic is just opposite. When you are relaxed, your blood pressure goes down, your heart rate goes down, your muscle tone goes down. Is it clear? Okay. So if you see a lion suddenly in this room, what will happen? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Sympathetic, right? Activation will occur. Okay. So when sympathetic activation occurs, a chemical is released into your body. Adrenaline. Have you heard that? So sympathetic activation causes the release of what? Adrenaline. Have you heard this? Chemical, adrenaline. Sometimes you'll see in movie, ads, they said this movie has a lot of suspense. Your adrenaline pump, right, will go up. So that's the sympathetic activation. Okay, so that is the classification of the nervous system. This is a nice chart, you see, exactly what I have explained you is shown here. Okay, so this is central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system includes the nerves. They have shown by blue and red two different types of nerves: sensory or afferent, blue, taking the signal towards the brain, and motor or efferent by red lines. Okay, you see, taking the signal out. Okay, and motor could be voluntary or involuntary. Okay, voluntary or somatic, involuntary or autonomic, and I'll give you the examples. Okay, now the cells of the neural tissue or nervous tissue. Two types of cells are present in the neural tissue. One is called the neurons and another neuroglial cells. Neurons are the main cells and glial cells are the supporting cells. Okay, so those are two types of cells. Neurons are the main cells and neuroglial cells are called supporting cells. Okay, so two types of cells. If you see a neuron, neuron looks like this. You all know already. Neuron looks like this. Has dendrite, cell body, axon. Cell body, and long process is the axon. Okay. So from one side of the cell body, short branching processes, multiple short branching processes arise, and those are called the dendrites. And from the other side, a long single process arises, and that is called the axons. Okay, so that is the neuron. Neuroglial cells could be different types, and they have different shapes. First, let's see the functions of the neurons and the neuroglial cells. For neurons, just know that production and transmission of electrical signal. Production or generation and transmission of what kind of signal? Electrical signal. That is the function of the neuron in one sentence. Neuroglial cells, however, has a number of functions because there are different types of neuroglial cells and they perform different types of functions. There are different types of neuroglial cells. Some important functions of the neuroglial cells are: some neuroglial cells can migrate or move towards the site of injury. If in your nervous system, for example in your brain, any injury occurs, some neuroglial cells will move there. Make sense? To do what? To engulf the dead cells, injured cells, to clean that area. Make sense? To clean that area. It's interesting, right? They will move there and perform some important functions. Some neuroglial cells can engulf the microorganisms if any infection occurs in your nervous tissue. Some neuroglial cells can do what? Phagocytosis. It's like macrophage. Will engulf the microorganisms. Some neuroglial cells guide the migration of young neurons. This is interesting. You know, when your brain is formed, just think about a fetus. Okay? Fetal brain is the developing brain, right? Brain is formed, different structures are formed in the brain. So what happens? Neurons move from one place to another. Make sense? Like these are the neurons. These are the neurons, and they move to different directions to form different parts of the brain in the growing brain. Okay? So, who will guide these young neurons? Young neurons to move to different directions. Some neuroglial cells, those are present in the brain or neural tissue, will guide them that you move to this direction, you move to this direction, you move to this direction. Make sense? To form different parts. So guiding the young neurons migration. Some neuroglial cells can secrete neurochemicals. Secrete what? Neurochemicals. To regulate the chemical environment inside the brain or nervous tissue. And another very important function is insulation. You know that nerve signal transmission is electrical signal transmission. So signal goes very fast, like electricity. Now you know in your house electrical wires are covered by insulation, right? Electrical wires are covered by what? Insulation. To make the transmission efficient, reduce the loss of electricity. So if you cover, that will make the transmission faster and reduce the loss of electricity. So that's why insulation is very important. So for example, this is a nerve fiber or axon. So it is covered by neuroglial cell, insulated by neuroglial cell. So the signal will go fast, okay, and efficient. So some neuroglial cells do that, insulation. Important neuroglial cells. There are many different types of neuroglial cells. These are some important ones. You need to remember the names, and I will mention one or two things about each type. You have to remember, not too many, but one or two. So, important neuroglial cells include astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, oligodendrocytes, satellite cells, and Schwann cells. Now, these three, the last three, form insulation. Last three do what? Form insulation. Okay. So let's go over those 6 different types of neuroglial cells. Astrocytes looks like what? What do you think? Star, astronomy, you know that, right? So astrocytes look like stars, star-shaped cells. Most abundant type, most common type of neuroglial cells are astrocytes. Okay? Function. astrocytes this is the brain again, and inside the brain these are the capillaries, okay, and what happens, you see, this is very interesting. Let me draw a capillary here, like this is a capillary in the brain. These are capillaries, and this is the astrocyte, and astrocyte sends process like this, and these processes, footstep like processes, cover the outer surface of the capillary. This is another astrocyte, you see, sends process, and that covers the outer layer or outside of the capillary like this. Like this. So this is the capillary here. Let me draw here. This is the capillary in the brain, and blood is here inside the capillary, right? And these are the neurons, and this is the astrocyte. Sends process that covers the outer surface of the capillary like this. Another astrocyte here, sends process that covers the outer surface. Another astrocyte here covers the outer surface, okay? So now you see why that is important. In your brain, brain tissue is highly sensitive. So that extra layer around the capillary of the brain is given by the astrocyte, and that prevents certain chemicals get out from the blood into the brain tissue and protects the brain. And that's why that is called the blood-brain barrier, the capillary wall and the astrocyte layer is called the blood-brain barrier. The barrier between the blood and the brain tissue. So the chemicals will not be able to easily pass and enter into the brain tissue. Make sense? So protecting the brain, blood-brain, by forming the blood-brain barrier, astrocytes protect your brain from certain toxic chemicals. You see, this is the capillary and astrocyte sending processes, and that is covering the capillary. Okay. So, if I ask you, the shape of astrocyte is what?
Star.
Star. It is the most common type, neuroglial cells, right? And I also said the most very important function is what? Forming blood-brain barrier, right? Giving extra layer around the capillary in the brain. Okay. Microglial cells. Microglial cells are phagocytic cells. They can do phagocytosis. So they can engulf the microorganisms or dead cells. So cleaning and providing defensive function, protecting the brain from microorganisms. Ependymal cells. Inside the brain, you have some fluid-filled cavities. Some cavities filled with fluid. For example, this is the brain. Inside the brain, you have a cavity here that is called lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle. This cavity is filled with fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Okay? And in the wall of these ventricles, you have the ependymal cells, another type of neuroglial cell. And the ependymal cells have cilia, soft hair-like structures like this. You know cilia already. So cilia are attached to the ependymal cells. So these are the ependymal cells attached to the wall of the ventricle, and cilia come out from the cells. And fluid is here. So this cilia beat like this to move the fluid away. Make sense? To move the fluid, bit like this. So ependymal cells are present where? Inside the ventricles, in the wall of the ventricles. What are the ventricles? Fluid-filled cavities inside the brain. And by moving the cilia, ependymal cells help to move the fluid, move the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, you see here how they look like. Now, other three types of cells, neuroglial cells, I said, form insulation. Let's go over those three. Oligodendrocyte. This is the cell body of oligodendrocyte, and from the cell body, you see, processes come out, and they do what? Form myelin sheath around the axon or nerve fibers. So these yellow structures are the nerve fibers, and I told you that around the nerve fibers you have insulation covering. So you see oligodendrocyte forms myelin sheath, and you see that wraps the nerve fiber by forming many layers. So heavily insulated. Okay. Now, oligodendrocytes, remember this is important, I may ask, oligodendrocytes form myelin sheath or insulation around the nerve fibers. Where? In the central nervous system. Not in the peripheral nervous system, in the central nervous system. That means in the brain and the spinal cord. Now, satellite cells and Schwann cells. These two types of neuroglial cells form insulation in the peripheral nervous system, PNS. Among these two, Schwann cells, these are Schwann cells, form insulation around the nerve fiber. And satellite cells form insulation around the cell body. So, in the peripheral nervous system, the satellite cells do what you see here, form insulation around the cell body, like this. Okay? Satellite cells. And the Schwann cells form insulation around the nerve fibers or axons, like this. So, but both in the peripheral nervous system, okay, or PNS. So, those information I gave you are very important. I may ask you a couple of few questions from there, okay? So, let me go back. Astrocytes look like what? Stars. They are most common type, abundant, right? And the very important function of astrocyte is what? Forming blood-brain barrier. The layer between the blood and the brain tissue, right? So the chemicals, toxic chemicals will not be able to get out. Make sense? Your brain is highly sensitive, right? So it should be protected. Is it clear? Okay. Then we talked about microglia. Microglia are what kind of cells? Phagocytic. That means they can engulf, right? The microorganisms and dead, injured cells. So protecting the brain, defensive function. Ependymal cells are found where? In the wall of the ventricles, right? What are the ventricles? Fluid filled cavities inside the brain. Is it clear? And ependymal cells have what? Cilia, right? And by moving the cilia, they help move the fluid. Make sense? Move the fluid. Now, other three types of neuroglial cells form insulation. Among those three, oligodendrocytes form insulation around the nerve fibers of the central nervous system, and satellite cells and Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. Satellite cells form insulation around the cell body, and Schwann cells form insulation around the nerve fiber or axon in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so those are important neuroglial cells or supporting